AITA for asking too many questions during lecture prompting my professor to berate me. I am not the OOP posted from 2 accounts. Remote Narwhal 4814 and Remote Narwhal revived. AITA for asking too many questions during lecture prompting my professor to berate me. Originally posted to r. Am I the asshole? Originally posted to r. AITAH. Original post recovered with raw Reddit April 9, 2023. Okay. For context. Yes. I am that one student in the class who asks a lot of questions during lecture. I also have a tendency to dominate class discussions when the professor gives us problems to solve. I'm a pre-med student and getting into medical school is the one goal I am determined to achieve, and as a result of that motivation, I approach every course with enthusiasm. Most professors like it when I engage. But I know it can get annoying when I do it too much, and the professors I have always let me know when I'm overdoing it, which I am grateful for. That being said, in my molecular biology class, I bring with me the same enthusiasm I have in my other classes. I also ask a lot of questions in this class, and one day, I raised my hand to ask a question regarding the lecture material. The molecular biology professor called on me, and I asked a question which prompted him to berate me in front of the whole class. Basically, he said, I can't have you interrupting my every 5 minutes for a lecture I only have 50 minutes to give. At the end of the class, I overheard a few students in my class thanking him for berating me after I asked a question. On the one hand, I understand why he was mad. But on the other hand, if he didn't want me to interrupt him during lecture, why would he call on me to ask a question when my hand was raised? Like seriously, if he wanted no interruptions during lecture, why would he call for that interruption by acknowledging my signal, hand raising, and asking me what I had a question about? I felt like he was baiting me just so he could have a reason to yell at me in front of the whole class. A class where 40% of the students are on their phones looking at social media. I cried that night and tried to vent my feelings to my own brother. I had no one else to go to, who basically responded by telling me it was my fault. He then told me that no one likes the kid who keeps asking questions in class. After a few days analyzing the events that took place, I now feel a great deal of anger towards my professor for embarrassing me in front of the whole class. I scheduled office hours with him so that we could go over the material I had trouble understanding. And I'm seriously considering demanding an apology from him. I would understand his reaction if I was simply shouting my questions out while he was lecturing. But I wasn't. I followed social convention. I raised my hand, and he called on me, which signaled to me that it was okay for me to ask that question. AITA? Should I demand an apology from him? Update. For additional context, regarding my other lectures, whenever the professor has brought it up to my attention that I am dominating or asking too many questions, I always try to limit the amount of questions I ask while giving others a chance to engage in that course. Update 2. Okay, I get that I am the asshole for asking too many questions. But can someone explain this to me? If a professor doesn't want me to ask any more questions, why would they call on me when I have my hand raised? That's the part that confuses me most. Info Update 3. Forgot to include this context. I wasn't asking 78 questions in one lecture, but more like 23 every other lecture. The berating started on the second question of that lecture. Verdict. Asshole. Update May 7, 2023. #PLEASE note. I was unable to recover the missing content due to changes with Reddit's API, but I saved it at the time of the original update posting. Unfortunately, this post can't be placed on the original subreddit, but I think it's important anyway. At the time, I was so embarrassed and mad over this situation that I deleted my account out of frustration. But to be clear, your advice has not fallen on deaf ears. I finally accepted my judgment and immediately apologized to my professor. I told him I was seeking out professional help to try and solve this problem. He apologized for reacting the way he did and hugged me before we went over some of the concepts I asked about in his class. As for me, I sought out professional help from a therapist. I told her my background, which I believe led to my behavior in college. Basically, when I was in high school, I had the opposite problem described in the post above. Teachers always criticized me for being lazy and turning my work in late. On my final day of high school, my science teacher told me to give up on med school. He told me that with my current attitude, I would never succeed in an environment where dozens of other more talented pre-meds would compete to get into medical school. His words really stuck with me, and I got very anxious because of it. Before I started, I promised myself that I would be more engaging and ask more questions in lecture to show the professors that I really cared. While this approach raised my GPA in college, it alienated my classmates. My mind was racing every lecture, and I felt compelled to ask a question, literally any question, or feel like a failure. After hearing about this, my therapist suggested I see a psychiatrist, who put me on SSRIs. Ever since taking these meds, the impulse to shoot my hand up and ask a question has become more controllable. Furthermore, my anxiety is under control and I feel more hopeful about the future. I told my molecular biology professor about my situation, and he told me that instead of looking at my fellow classmates as competitors I have to elbow out of the way to succeed. I should consider them as teammates to help lift up. So I did just that. I agreed to join him in office hours where he and I would help other pre-meds in his class and other classes. He also teaches biochemistry, prepare for their final exams. I ended up finishing his class with an A, and if that wasn't the cherry on top, I found out he also played Warzone. We exchanged gamer tags and we've been playing a lot of DMZ online as teammates. Occasionally he gets frustrated with me cause I keep dying a lot in game. But we still get along. I will be applying to medical school this year and he has offered me an opportunity to do research with him over the summer to help boost my application. I am very thankful to him for this opportunity and to you all for helping me snap out of my arrogance. Thank you. Relevant comments. It is not a manual 1984. Good for you. Congrats. Very pleasantly surprised that Reddit AITA is actually does some good. Oop replied, thank you so much for your help. I can't believe I let this problem run on for over 2 years. But I guess it's better late than never to fix it. Rip Sunnydale. Wonderful update. I'm so pleased about how everything turned out. Oop replied, thanks. Unfortunately, the damage I've done to my relationship with my classmates can't be undone. But I can only strive to become more self-aware and considerate in the future. A little tough. Constructive criticism really goes a long way. This is a repost sub IAM, not the oop. I took a beginner's home maintenance class many years ago. When I signed up for a beginner's class, it's because I was a beginner. I needed, this is a hammer. You hold it from this end. There were 2 guys in the class who derailed almost every class with incredibly detailed questions about doing electrical work. If you have copper wire in this size, of this age, and this precise number of boxes, and there goes the entire rest of the session. I would have been so grateful if the instructor had done what this lecturer did. Instead of allowing 2 people to waste 15 people's time week after week. I'm always of the opinion there is no such thing as a dumb question. But there is a time and place. The questions that OOP is asking are probably better directed to office hours. This reminds me of this gal I knew in college. I had this one classmate in my chem lectures. Everyone hated it when she raised her hand because her questions always derailed the already short lecture. A lot of her questions would be answered on the next slide or not on topic. She was fine, just liked to ask a lot of questions and needed the answer then and there. It got to the point where one of the professors went, "That's a great question. Hold on to that," and moved on. It worked for the most part, and she asked less questions as the semester went in. I think there was one time she raised her question for the 4th time and the professor didn't even acknowledge her. I was sitting in a spot where I can see her getting more irritated the longer she had her hand up. It was probably 5 minutes before she gave up. Usually my profs just tell us to ask any questions that we may have at the end of class or come by their office during office hours. They understand that they can't keep answering questions when they have to teach a whole lesson in less than an hour. As we aren't there, we can't tell what it was like. When I was at uni, I was the oldest in my cohort, and as my cohort was particularly shy, I didn't mind being the one putting myself out there and asking questions, even dumb ones. But timing of questions is important. Lecturers have a limit of time, and if the questions were off topic, I can see why a lecturer would want to move on. Honestly, I think it can be a learning curve for people. Lecturers don't want students to not engage, but if you have too many questions, it's always better to write them down. Then you can go over them with the learning resources and/or book some time with a lecturer to go over them. I lecture in a med school. This kid would fit right in. They're all so eager to demonstrate how smart they are. I imagine the reason the professor lost it after the question was asked was that it was very clear that the question wasn't coming from a genuine place of trying to understand the material. In my experience, there were 2 types of people who ask questions in lecture. 1. Those who are genuinely curious. 2. Those who are trying to show how smart they are. I've found those who ask the most questions are either gone by drop, add deadline, or fall into the second category. Having been through an engineering degree, I had a hunch of the exact type of individual op was before even reading it. The type to ask questions which have at best a vague or tangential relationship to the actual lecture in an attempt to validate themselves by demonstrating their supposed mastery of the material or intelligence to the rest of the class. It very quickly grows extremely irritating to the rest of the class, as all it does is derail the already limited, precious lecture time. There is definitely such a thing as asking too many questions during lecture. The professor is trying to convey the material in a set amount of time. The reason why professors call on people who have questions is that perhaps the student doesn't understand something and they can clarify the information for the whole class. But you definitely can come across the students who ask questions that are only tangentially related to the topic and are clearly asking because they signaling to others that they are very smart. Or sometimes they just want to hear their own voice. If someone is genuinely confused, this is what office hours are there for. Typically, the professor and the TA have some time set aside where you can go deeper into the topic if you're passionate or you need help. Or, depending on the setup of the class, there are discussion periods with other students, or labs where you can discuss the material. Even then, there's always the option to email the professor, TA, with any added questions. Lecture isn't the only place where your curiosity needs instant gratification. Pleasantly surprised to see a positive update on this one. I read the original and it's such a fine line between engaging questions and questions totally Derailing the lecture, it's hard to give advice on, especially without being in the same class. Also glad that it led to a positive relationship with a teacher. As someone who also had to tone down questions so as not to take over discussions inappropriately, it doesn't surprise me that there was some anxiety-induced teachers petting happening here. Also props to my former history professor who straight up told me I wasn't allowed to answer any more questions during exam review because he already knew I knew the answers. Lol. I needed to hear it. As a professor, I started this post pissed at the arrogance of this kid. Demand an apology from a professor who is trying to provide information to a class full of learners for them to take home and digest? Who holds office hours to reinforce the material? I don't think so. Absolutely not. Of course any professor would stop for a raised hand because maybe I wasn't clear about something. And emergencies happen in the middle of class. Students have alerted me to campus crises. Major real-time news announcements like when the Queen died in the middle of class, etc. Anyway, by the end of this post I was proud of everyone involved. This will only make the student a better medical professional and the professor a better teacher. Loved this BORU. If this was a regular thing every lecture, then the OOP got what they got. This is a college-level class. And pre-med. This isn't just about asking too many questions but also figuring out how to find the answer on your own. I'm a teacher. If someone is asking too many questions, you simply say, "Can you keep your questions until the end of class or ask me during my office hours?" It's called classroom management, and enabling a student then shaming them in front of a class is absolutely not the right way to handle it. The student may very well be on the spectrum and not even realize how disruptive they are being. I had a friend like this in high school, except all the questions he would ask just parroted back what was just said. The teacher would explain something, and his hand would shoot up and he'd repeat what she just said back and ask if that was correct. This would happen anywhere between 510 times a class. Drove everyone in class insane. I paid tuition for the lecture and professor, not some students' questions. 2 or 3 questions in 50 minutes lecture is fine, but any more than that is for office hours. Why would he call on me to ask a question when my hand was raised? Because your hand was raised? Was he supposed to ignore a raised hand for who knows how long, cause you think professor might have not seen you? It's a bit of a different situation cause it was a class discussion. But one time a professor told us, if you have your hand raised while someone else is talking, I'm not gonna call you. If your hand is raised, it means you're not listening to anything the other person is saying and instead you're just thinking about what you want to say. It stuck with me so much. It's true. Even in conversations, if you're just thinking of something you want to say, you're not listening to anything. Asking questions is not bad, but it needs to be something to build upon a broader topic. You can ask a couple of clarifying questions. But especially at uni level, if you are genuinely lost at some point, you need to realize either you've not covered your bases well enough or you need a private session with the professor, and you can't expect everyone to waste time explaining something you're the only one not getting. Had a classmate in law school like this before she finally went to office hours, like we'd been telling her for 2 years instead of interrupting the lectures for dumb hypotheticals. I get that's how she learns. There's a time and a place. And that's office hours. Not in an 80-person lecture. Fuck, it was so annoying. She's a great attorney now, for the record. And a genuinely good person. But fuck, stop talking. I used to be a TA in grad school. And when I started a class, I usually noted that I understood that the topics I would be presenting are complicated and students were going to have questions. And I encouraged them to ask. because they were important topics. But the way I structured my lectures, I might actually answer the question they were thinking of a few minutes down the line. So if you didn't get it at first, if you kept listening, I might actually answer your question organically through instruction. But I also understood that questions asked too far past the original topic would just slow down the class if we had to back up. So they should anticipate that I would always have a "Okay, this is a good place for questions" who has one pause before I moved on. If they could hold their questions until we got to those checkpoints, then we'd be in a good spot to review the information. Or I could note their question might be getting ahead of themselves. If that was the case, I'd make a note on the board so we could make sure that question was answered in the proper place. It took a bit more work as far as lecture development when I had to make sure I broke my topics up into chunks with good breaking points and left time to basically re-review each section if necessary. But it kept the people who like to ask questions from constantly breaking the flow of the lecture. And usually, they would ask the questions shyer students were too embarrassed to ask. So it worked out for everyone. It also allowed for basically an immediate review of the topic, which was great for reinforcement. And the entire class got the topic in cohesive chunks. For one specific class, my mentor told me when he taught it, the average grade was a mid-low C. He wasn't a bad teacher, but it was a hideously complicated topic, but I'd brought it up to a high B 2 years in a row. So I must have been doing something right. There is a balance between letting students ask questions and not allowing one or two people to constantly dominate the topic. You prep a lecture to build up and explain a topic. And if someone is asking constant questions, it breaks up the logical progression. Then no one gets it except the one person whose brain works in little tiny fragments. Some topics are more complex and require you take in a bigger chunk of info and let it percolate. 2 seconds in, and I hate him already. Think that if he's asking so many questions until the point it becomes obstructive to the rest of the class, he needs to start writing down his questions and see the professor after class or in office hours. People who keep interrupting a class can ruin the flow of the class and slow down the class itself. I've seen a few times where a professor let people interrupt the course too often ruined the class itself. In graduate school, I was in a statistics course where the course had one student in it who had no business being in the class. Her math level was probably mid-high school level at best, not graduate school level. The professor tried his best to answer every single question the student asked, but she was simply too many years behind everyone to understand the course. Nothing got done by the end of the semester. We were still trying to learn simple regression when the teacher realized that the course was a 2-part course, and if every student went into part 2, taught by a different teacher, without learning multiple regression, it would look bad on him. So he tried to teach everyone multiple regression in 1 or 2 class periods. He failed, as did every single student on the final exam. With one exception, one foreigner had taken statistics 4 times before, fell asleep in the middle of every class, and aced the exam. In this student's case, the professor should have talked to him in private, not do it publicly. Public humiliation just makes people angry.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.